Okay, well, I'm going to tell you a quick story of how this world got here, the digital universe we all live in that everybody takes for granted. And it's a story going back to when you could actually see the bits. I mean, now we see bits that are, they're in solid state memory in my laptop and I'm projecting them up there. But at the very beginning of this whole thing, this is February 1953, these are charged spots on the face of a cathode ray oscilloscope tube. So that square is actually about 2 inches square on the face of a 5-inch tube. And each bit, the light is not the important thing. The light is a byproduct of the electric charge, because there is electric charge. The screen happens to be phosphorescent. You see it, but you don't really need to see it. This kind of memory would work fine even if you couldn't see the spots. But the beauty of it is you can see them. So there's 32 by 32. So that's 1 kilobit, 1,024 bits. And these spots, some very clever people figured out how to make these spots, how to read and write them with 24 microsecond access time. So that was the big new thing. We had computers, lots of computers before then. We had lots of computers after, but we never had memory that worked that fast. In fact, the transition really was, before that, memory worked at the speed of sound. We had delay line memory, and then at this moment, memory started working at the speed of light. And that really was a big change. I'm going to tell you how that happened. And this is sort of the story that's in this new book that just came out that has an absolutely fantastic cover.
Did you personally meet Turing?
No, he died. I was 1 year old when he died. But when you're an author, you live in fear of 3 communications from your publisher. The first is when they reject your book at the beginning. They say, it's a beautiful book, but we can't publish it. And then if for some miracle they say, yes, we will publish it, then you get the next frightening thing, which is a couple years later you get a letter saying, where is the manuscript? We are going to cancel your contract. And if you make it through that, because your book's never done, and a couple years later they can't really cancel your contract. But then you finally get a letter, when you do submit the manuscript, then you get a letter saying, we've designed a cover and we think you will like it. And that's invariably just a terrible disappointment. I mean, but in this case, I got that note and I opened the file and wow, this was really a great idea for a cover. It was not my idea. A designer named Peter Mendelsohn thought this up and apparently drove the people at Knopf crazy because he was hammering these holes with a metal punch at his desk. And they complained, but anyway, it's a brilliant idea. So there's a reason that the story's mostly not about Alan Turing. It's about Johnny von Neumann, who implemented Alan Turing's ideas, but everyone was clear, even particularly von Neumann was clear that these were Turing's ideas that he was realizing in a physical way. So Alan Turing is the center of attention. That's Alan at age 5, who made this statement, which is still true today, that being digital is more interesting than being electronic. But if you can do both, it gets really interesting. If you can be both digital and electronic. So that's what happened in this sort of, it looks to us like this suddenly happened after World War II. It all just, like the Cambrian explosion. And actually, it happened during World War II, but primarily in secret. So when the war was over and the secrecy was lifted, suddenly all this technology came to life. Von Neumann at age 7, so they were, in a way, sort of mathematical twins, separated at birth.
Turing.
Von Neumann? They both died. Well, Turing died even younger. Turing died at 41.
Suicide, yeah.
Well, no, it was. We don't know it's suicide. It drives me crazy. People say it was suicide. We have no proof that Alan Turing committed suicide. We have Alan Turing there, poisoned by cyanide, and lots of plausible reasons that he possibly did not commit suicide. So
he was pretty fit, wasn't he, with John?
And he had a lot to look forward to. There's no proof that he committed suicide.
That's right.
And von Neumann died at age 53 of cancer, and there's good reason to believe that may have had something to do with all the plutonium. And I don't think it was the bomb tests, which were really not that dirty, but the making of the bombs at that time was very dirty, and von Neumann was the kind of guy who you couldn't keep him out of the lab. So they were sawing plutonium with handsaws and stuff like that. He may well have. My theory is he picked up a particle of plutonium and he came down with bone cancer. So, but this was one of his statements that clearly is a credit to Alan Turing, that when von Neumann starts to build this machine in 1940, he says, let's look at the whole world as a unbounded paper tape, and that's what the internet is. All the internet is this unbounded length of tape that we all share. We all have access to the same tape, but it's still, every bit of computation we do today still follows the one-dimensional model of Turing, and then what von Neumann did was make that one-dimensional model two-dimensional. It gave us the address matrix.
I'm glad to know it wasn't red tape. I thought it was red tape.
Well, a lot of it is. More and more of it. So, in 1935, Alan Turing, who's then 23 years old, he's not even he's an undergraduate. He writes this paper on computable numbers with an application to the Entscheidungs problem. And everybody remembers the computable numbers part because he invents essentially the universal digital computer. And they forget the Entscheidungs problem, which was really what he was trying to solve, and in some ways is almost more important to us today. That this result, the Entscheidungs problem is a decision problem, which to really corrupt it in a mathematical way is the question whether by looking at a sequence of code, of coded symbols, is there any systematic way to know whether that sequence is a provable theorem or not? And translating that into coding, it's sort of by looking at a code, is there any systematic way by looking at a piece of code to tell what that code will do? And there is not, except by running it. And that's why this digital world we live in is so interesting. You can never have a complete firewall. If you have a firewall that even admits arithmetic, there's things you're going to be unable to keep out. It's that's essentially a mathematical proof of why the digital universe will always be a wilderness. It will never be a completely controlled sort of national park. So, in trying to answer this question, Turing, who had no real interest in digital computing, he just was interested in mathematical logic. He invents the idea of a digital computing machine, and then in a very perverse way, which he had an incredible insight to see this, that you could prove that a very simple digital machine could do anything that any digital computer could do, and even this machine that can do anything, there are certain things it cannot do, and if you can show that there's something it cannot do, then the Entscheidungs problem falls apart, and he sort of won the prize by answering that question. And in the course of it, happened to invent this model of universal computation. So if that's the sort of sentence where it all comes to life, that all you have to do is build one machine, and then you can do everything else with software. And that's, of course, why you're all here. Doing code. Not how many people here actually build design logic gates or anything, chips. I mean, we're all here because we're doing software, I think. Yeah. So, and that seemed to have no practical significance in the world. In fact, Alan Turing wrote to his mother very depressed because only 2 requests for copies of his paper came in. And he thought this was really important, but only 2 people asked for copies. That was sad. And
So measure how important it was.
Yeah, but this was 1936 then, the paper appeared, and then very quickly we're heading into World War II, when suddenly this question of looking at codes and telling whether they were meaningful or not became a matter of life and death for the island country of England, whose supplies were being destroyed by the German U-boat fleet. And the German High Command was communicating on radio links, low-frequency radio, to the submarines with digital code. And so the British were able to intercept these signals. They were not hard to intercept, but they were impossible to unencrypt. And Turing got that job. And suddenly this question of this theoretical idea that you could build one machine that could emulate other machines became, because the Germans were clearly encrypting these codes with a machine, but we didn't know what the machine was. So the people at Bletchley Park built a series of machines, starting with something called the bomb, and then this machine named the Colossus, which was a real Turing machine. This had a memory stored in 1,500 vacuum tubes, and that machine could run through enormous numbers of possible configurations of the...
There were no transistors at this time, right?
Well, there was actually, not in 1943. There were transistors a little later, but not... You couldn't buy them by the thousand. You could build them one by one. So it was much easier to buy vacuum tubes than build transistors. They had diodes then, but and the Swedish actually used them. So in 1946, that's Alan Turing getting on a bus. And so there's been this endless argument among the historians who kind of come in later and argue about credit over whether von Neumann properly credited Turing or not. And in fact, even the question of did von Neumann read Turing's paper or not has been argued about. And I decided to go look. So that's the copy of Turing's paper that's in von Neumann's library at the Institute for Advanced Study. If you go there, it's behind these shelves where you have to crank the wheels to open them up because nobody looks, and there are all the volumes of the Proceedings of the London Mathematical Society, and they're all crisply bound and like they'd been left from 1935, except the volume with Turing's paper that's completely disintegrated. From having been read by all those engineers who essentially tore it apart reading it over and over and over again. They didn't have photocopy machines to make a copy. They just and that's what the last surviving engineers I spoke with told me. They said, "Oh yeah, when we got to Princeton, von Neumann said, read this paper. This is what we're trying to do." So that's what he built. So that's the machine that von Neumann's gang of crazy engineers built. And the memory is in these tubes. Each one of these tubes is a war surplus oscilloscope tube with one of those 32 by 32 arrays. So there's 40 of these tubes. This machine is built like a V40 engine. So if you look at the memory matrix, it's a 32 by 32 by 40 bit matrix. So it's like 40 chessboards with 32 squares on a side stacked 40 layers high. And that was the space they worked in, which if you translate that in modern language, that's 5 kilobytes. That's all they had. and which used to be the memory of an icon, but now icons have got so big. It's still the memory. This memory allocated to your cursor is 5 kilobytes. So that's one of those kilobits. So it's quite amazing. We have the dates of these. These were diagnostic pictures. So these are like the early plates from the Mount Wilson telescope or something, where you have an image at the dawn of the. And a very easy number to remember is that's February 1953. There were 53 kilobytes of high-speed memory in the entire world at that time. And what they were doing with this machine, I came to this from being interested in what actually happened, and this is a page from all the logbooks of the engineers it turned out had survived. And this is, I think, one of the most interesting ones. Is that what the machine was really built for was to answer the question of whether a hydrogen bomb was feasible or not. But von Neumann couldn't resist any other interesting questions, so he also brought in meteorology. Anyone with a difficult problem he welcomed. And there was a Norwegian mathematical biologist who was trying to run evolution experiments. So this stop at 18.8 is the night. This is the night of 3rd March 1953. So they're running the first experiment trying to evolve self-replicating digital organisms within the memory of the machine. And they let Baricelli have the machine late at night, and then in the morning, the Los Alamos guys come back to work on the bomb, and it goes over. So Baricelli has to stop. That's the memory location where he stops his code, and they go to the next code. So that's sort of the trying to create life and trying to destroy life at the same time. And things we take completely for granted today, like the command line, they had to have a beginning. And the chief engineer was Julian Bigelow, who was a real engineer, built engines. And in his basement, he had died, but his widow let me look through his stuff. I found this crumpled up piece of paper that at the top says orders. Let a word 40 BD. So they didn't have the word bit yet. They were still saying binary digit. Be 2 orders. Each order equals C of A command, and there's the numbers, the memory locations for the command and the memory locations for the address. So that, as far as I can tell, is the origins of the command line. That's the piece of paper Neil Stevenson was looking, when he wrote his book. In the beginning was the command line, and I think that's.
And what year was it?
Well, it was 1946. It was probably early 1946, because we'll see the minutes of a meeting a little later where John Tukey stands up and gets tired of saying binary digit and says, let's just call it a bit. But since they were still using BD, it pretty much dates this to early 1946. And the dedication of my book is not, it's to Leibniz, who, the way I look at the history of digital computing, there's an Old Testament and a New Testament. In the Old Testament, the prophet was Leibniz, who gave us the logic, and the New Testament, the prophet was von Neumann, who gave us the machines, and Alan Turing was the guy in between, who came at this transition between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And Leibniz, so this statement was made in 1679, that it wasn't all just about AdWords and YouTube, it was about something else. And so he was saying that he saw that the commercialization of computing would be a dangerous thing, and was warning against it. So in that same year, 1679, Leibniz leaves this manuscript in Latin that's never been published in English. And
it's binary.
Yeah, he's working out all the algorithms for doing binary coding, and but what's important in this manuscript is that he invents a completely new kind of machine. He invents a fully digital computer that doesn't run. He says you can implement a machine without wheels. So we had then adding machines that worked with wheels and 10 digits on a wheel. So here he's talking about a computer that is run with gravity and marbles. You have black and white marbles, and they run down tracks. And he shows in a very elegant way that if you all you have to be able to do is shift the tracks, and you can do everything in binary arithmetic. And that's the shift register. That's the heart of how we are able to do computing. Except instead of marbles and gravity, we're using pulses of electrons and a voltage gradient. But it's exactly. He sees the key principle that will make this real, 300 years ahead of time. Yeah, and not only says this, but then perfectly identifies the sort of algorithms, the functions you need to do everything if you can do this. It's quite extraordinary. So then what von Neumann did really was just reinvent Leibniz. So this is the Bigelow's, and they argued again. We think a shift register is just given by God or something, but this, if you look at this is shifting register number 7. This was the 7th design that they looked at, and finally, there were all these possible different ways to do.
Von Neumann read Leibniz?
Von Neumann did read Leibniz, but I don't think he had read that manuscript. No,
He didn't read Latin.
he did read Latin. Yes. But this was clearly invented independently. I mean, this was done by his engineers who did not read Leibniz. But Gödel read Leibniz, and Gödel was there. So that is the first hardware, the prototype shifter. And this may still exist in Julian Bigelow's basement. It's amazing how much of the stuff is just if you become interested in history, it's sort of like the gateway drug. You start reading books, and then you start reading journals, and you start going to libraries, and you start going to archives, and finally you become only interested in stuff that isn't even in archives. It's just not been looked at by anyone. So this is
original bin of history.
So this is, and again, a very profound way of dealing with this. So you're trying to get the bits, you're shifting them from this register to that. But what if you lose a bit? You're doing this millions of times, cycles. So they make it positive interlock, where you never move a bit directly. It goes to an intermediate register, and then when all the bits are replaced, it signals, okay, we're all here, everything's okay, we can move. And if they don't get down intact, then they're still there. Your data is never volatile, and that's why, all our machines now run for billions of cycles and don't lose bits, because it's all run on that principle. So it's also how the internet works. You don't trust that anything's arrived until it tells you it's arrived. So this was all done in a very strange place, this Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, which was supposed to be just a temple of theoretical knowledge for its own beautiful sake, and they did not welcome engineers. And when von Neumann he had enough power to say, yes, I am bringing engineers, like it or not, they put him next to the men's lavatory in the basement, next to the boiler room in the middle of New Jersey. And partly this happened because of Oswald Veblen, who brought mathematicians in to work at the Army Proving Ground in World War I, and sort of did not have this prejudice against applied mathematics, and thought computing was actually important and interesting. He had a great eye for talent. This was his group in World War I, including Norbert Wiener, who sort of gave us the word cybernetics, who he hired, who had been fired from his first teaching job and was writing articles for the Encyclopedia Americana to survive, like living in his mother's basement, and Veblen rescued him. Abraham Flexner, who was sort of not the entrepreneur, but the administrator who put this whole idea together. He had he had been an educational reformer all his life, of this place where you could do whatever you wanted. It was sort of like Google gives you 20%, but here you were going to get 100%. And that then people would end up doing useful things. And in a way, he was right. And the money came from the Bambergers, who were the Jeff Bezos of the time, the department store owners who decided to do something useful with their money and sold their company to Macy's 6 weeks before the crash in 1929. So they ended up with a lot of money in the Depression. And they spent it very wisely by rescuing, of course they were Jewish, most of these people in this story were Jewish. And so this institute that was supposed to just be this theoretical paradise, it turned out played a very important role in becoming the first step in sort of an underground railroad to bring threatened academics out of Europe. And they were very cheap at the time. So they bring Kurt Gödel, who changed the world as much as anyone else, for $1,000, because we forget that at that time there was still a quota against Eastern European Jews, but everyone was looking for loopholes. It was not like Homeland Security where they're looking for a way to keep you out. The bureaucrats were actually looking for ways to let people in, and one of the loopholes was if you had a teaching appointment in the United States, you could get past the quota. So $1,000 to give lectures was enough to bring Gödel. They brought Stan Ulam, who also was a terribly important figure, Polish mathematician, for $300. That was enough to get him out of Poland, and then he went back and rescued his brother, and the entire rest of his family was killed. So there's in these files a long list of these people and decisions that had to be made about who could be rescued and who couldn't. That's the first mathematics faculty with Einstein and Frank Adelot. And I'm interested when I look at something like this, at all the people, not just the famous scientists, but in this case, who are the Larry and I were talking about our time at Blue Origin, a company in Seattle. So this was Bernetta Miller, who was the willow of this project. There's always someone who keeps everything going, the administrative secretary. So Bernetta Miller was the 5th woman to get her pilot's license in the United States. And then her eyesight started to go bad, so she was hired to run the institute. And she was very tough and good. And here she's, back then the American military only flew biplanes, airplanes with 2 wings, so you could shoot one wing off and you still had 3 pieces of wing left. And they didn't trust airplanes with only 1 wing, and so the French company was building airplanes with 1 wing, and they were trying to get a contract and they couldn't. So they decided they would hire a woman to fly the plane, and that would persuade the army that it was safe. And
how much it would be if you can't fly a mile and a woman can?
Right, exactly. So, and it worked. The American military switched to planes with 1 wing.
When was that photograph taken? Do you know?
1912. I got it from her grand nephew who lives in Seattle. So,
What's her name again?
Bernetta Miller. And her I can't remember the exact genealogy, but like her nephew, once removed or whatever, is Joseph Felsenstein, who's a great geneticist. So it's amazing how all these things come together. Johnny von Neumann with the red tie, and Oscar Morgenstern, with whom he wrote Theory of Games and Economic Behavior, which Einstein and Gödel, Kurt Gödel, who gets left out of the history of computing because he was very quiet, but he played an incredibly important role. If you look at the way computers work, so in this 32 by 32 by 40-bit matrix, you can store 40-bit strings of code. So with 5 bits on one side of the 5 bits gives you one side of the 32-bit chessboard and another 5 bits. So with 10 bits, you define an address that gives you a 40-bit string back. So if you put in 10 bits for an address and 10 bits for a instruction, that's 20 bits. You get back 40 bits. That's why we live in this crazy world, because as soon as they started that process, it's like 1 + 1 = 4. And in a way, it was Gödel, I think, who had that idea that, because in his great proof that Turing had studied and von Neumann actually was involved with, he showed how you could encode mathematical statements as logical strings and then give them arithmetic addresses and manipulate the addresses, and then you're actually manipulating the logic. And that's really how this whole von Neumann idea came into existence.
Even the way they are for the camera.
Oh, right.
And there's von Neumann at age 11 with his cousin Lily. So even then, he was trying to impress the girls, and he did very he did very well. And in World War I, they're at a Austro-Hungarian artillery emplacement, and he's the kid sitting on the barrel of the cannon. So he loved weapons. And his family in Budapest. So Budapest, between World War I and World War II, Budapest was the center of the world. I mean, they had the most advanced subway system in the world. They had the best educational system. It was paradise for, and they combined sort of intellectual and artistic life in a way that when these people, ended up refugees in the United States, they, von Neumann has this reputation as being this great party guy, but that was just completely normal. That was just the world he had grown up with. And Clary, whose journals I had access to, I mean, they would have parties with 100 people that went on 3 days and get a lot of work done in the process. So that's von Neumann's identity card from the University of Berlin, where he resigned in disgust against the Nazis. How could they be destroying this, intellectual world? And he, of course, came to America.
When did he leave Germany?
He left 1930, so he left in advance of having to leave.
Oh, that's good.
And that's Princeton in the 1930s. So these are all, everybody in that picture is Hungarian from Budapest except Percy Robertson, who was teaching quantum physics to Alan Turing. Alan Turing was in Princeton at that time. And he's from Hoquiam, Washington. And Amelia Wigner is from Madison, Wisconsin. Everybody else is from Budapest. So that's Edward Teller, John von Neumann, his first wife, Eugene Wigner, and Johnny's first wife, Mariette. So these people who were rescued for $300, $1,000, they ended up saving, in a very real way, saving the free world, and the atomic bomb project at Los Alamos would never happen without all those rescued Eastern European Jews. And you have to keep that in perspective when you try and understand why were people like von Neumann and Edward Teller so fanatic about building this even more terrible weapon, the hydrogen bomb. And you also have to remember that during that time at Los Alamos, von Neumann was actually not working so much on the atomic bomb. He was already working on the hydrogen bomb with a guy named Klaus Fuchs. They were collaborating on a design that actually looked quite successful. And it turned out Klaus Fuchs was a Soviet spy. So as far as von Neumann knew, the Russians already knew everything we knew about. And so this question of whether a hydrogen bomb really would work or not did seem to be a sort of life or death question. And that was the big push to do them. So there we have Johnny von Neumann, Dick Feynman, and Stan Ulam. And a photo taken by Nick Metropolis, who invented the co-inventor of the Monte Carlo algorithm. And that I got from François Ulam, a original 8x10 silver print, just a treasure.
Feynman there.
How old?
Yeah.
Well, he's whatever, he was like 30 or something. And he's his Marlon Brando look. So these three men were all completely theoreticians. Before the war, they were working in, Ulam was working in measure theory, mathematical logic. Von Neumann was doing mathematical logic. Feynman was quantum physics. And then suddenly they got to work with real things, real hardware, real machines, real explosives. And they weren't going to go back. And the question was, what was next? And von Neumann knew that computers was going to be the big, exciting thing. And we had computers. The British had their code-breaking computers. In fact, they had not only computers, they had a computing industry. At Bletchley Park, at the end, they had 11 of those Colossus machines. So we had only one. This is the ENIAC. But in Britain, they already had an industry that was replicating computers. The ENIAC was so big, you walk inside it, and it was, in its own way, it was more advanced because it was what we now would call a multiple core processor. It had 20 cores, and for what it was designed to do, that was a better way of doing it. And then von Neumann, we forever will argue about who actually had the idea that these big racks are function registers that would store the ballistic coefficients and so on, and they could store about 300 numbers, and somebody had the idea that you could actually store sequences of code in those registers and turn this ENIAC into what we now would call a stored program machine. Mm-hmm. So von Neumann comes in 1945, puts together a report with other people's ideas clearly of how you could take the ENIAC, take the ideas that had been developed in ENIAC, and build a much more advanced machine that really was what we now call the von Neumann architecture, with a central arithmetic unit, a memory, and input-output. Really nothing's changed. And why did that take over the world? In fact, it was being asked standing out in the hall waiting for the room to open, because very similar, in fact, better ideas were going on in England and other places, but this von Neumann architecture is the one we're all stuck with. And partly was because this also was unknown, but May 1st, 1945, von Neumann is already consulting for IBM. So the prevailing view is that von Neumann was such a great, generous man that he said, no, we're not going to patent any of this for the good of the open source movement to come and all this thing. But in reality, the fact that they didn't patent anything was very much to the benefit of IBM, because it meant that IBM could go full speed ahead. And in fact, IBM had people down to the Institute every week, taking notes on everything that was going on. Another important figure in the story is Vladimir Zworykin, the man in the center going duck hunting there, who was led the RCA labs in Princeton. He had also escaped from Russia in 1919 through the Arctic, through the Russian Arctic, came to New York, classic $1, and got a job running an adding machine at the Russian Purchasing Commission. And he had worked on television in Russia, and he ended up being the person who really commercialized television in the United States, to the detriment of Farnsworth, who was here already. But Zworykin really wanted to push RCA into computing. So the earliest meetings of this project actually were in Zworykin's office at RCA. So if you see there, meeting number 1, November 1945, the 5th person on the list is John Tukey, the statistician. And it was Tukey who just got fed up with saying binary digit and abbreviated it to bit. So in that first meeting, they lay out these sort of founding principles that the system has a central clock. The design is modular, so if something goes wrong, you can pull out the motherboard or pull out you don't have to fix the whole thing. And words coding the orders are handled in the memory just like numbers. That's the critical thing, that data and the instructions live in the same memory. And in a way that you can look at that breaks the distinction between numbers that mean things and numbers that do things. Up till then, numbers represented things, and suddenly now you have numbers actually are order codes and can do things. We're sort of giving power to these numbers in a way that has, but of course, in my view, sort of gone completely out of control now, where the numbers really are running things. And
That's cute.
that's Akravo Emanuelidis, who was hired on the ENIAC project. Her parents were Greek. Her guidance counselor said, you can't go to college with this Greek immigrant background, but you could get a job on this project at University of Pennsylvania. So she was hired on the ENIAC project at age 16 and did so well that Hermann Goldstein and von Neumann brought her to Princeton at 17. And so she's going to be the last person left. There's only one of the original engineers still alive, and Akravo is still in her 80s. In fact, she came with me to a couple of my lectures, one at the Computer History Museum, where they didn't want to let her on stage because she's 85 and they were filming for KQED, but during question period she came up on stage and just stole the show.
That's good.
She was there, knew everybody, saw, was not a scientist, so observed all the human things and typed the original report. So like this report, which was typed in the annex to Gödel's office on a manual typewriter, she typed that and didn't get her own computer until 2009. Her daughter got her a Mac. And now she sends me email all the time. So it's amazing that we live in this world where so much of this happened in one lifetime. I mean, in the memory of someone who was a teenager. In fact, I think you probably all know that Alan Turing would be 100 this year. So in a different universe, he could still be alive. So RCA, what Zworykin was going to build, I mean, people question, why did von Neumann build this machine at this place? Because they didn't even have a laboratory. They had to build their own workbenches, and this was right after the war. Lumber was rationed, so they had to build their workbenches out of firewood, because you couldn't buy lumber, but you could buy firewood. And one of the reasons is because RCA was going to supply this plug-and-play memory. This is, I think, very important in the history of how we got the architecture we did. This was a sort of vaporware called the Selectron. That was a 4,000-bit memory tube in a vacuum tube. It was like a USB stick. You just plug it in, and you've got 4 kilobits of memory, but it had to be built by hand, and they never got it. The tragedy was that RCA just refused. They're putting all their money into television. No, we're not going to. So the whole project was done by 3 people, and in the end they got a 256-bit Selectron running, and when they put it in one computer, and they ran 100,000 hours mean time between failure. So the machine that ran these Selectrons was at Rand, where a lot of the internet was invented, but the Selectron didn't get running in time to work in von Neumann's machine. But the architecture of the machine was designed expecting these 4,000-bit plug-in memory modules, and that's in a lot of ways why we ended up with this architecture that was so ready for solid state when solid state happened. When we got our, now we have these wonderful SIMs and DIMMs that just, you can plug in your 4 megabytes of memory, and it's because that architecture was sort of expecting that. And
when did the Selectron come online?
Finally, 1952, they get, Rand says we're going to order. They ordered 100 256-bit Selectrons. They put them in the RAND machine. They ran till 1970. Just fantastic. I mean, it was like the dinosaur with feathers. It was sort of the integrated circuit inside a vacuum tube. And if solid state hadn't come along, anybody who had RCA shares would be, they would be the big company in the world. So the poor guys in Princeton, these engineers in the basement, were desperate. What could they do? And over in England, the group led by Tom Kilburn and Frederick C. Williams, they had got a working memory on the face of a cathode ray tube at the Manchester machine, which Alan Turing was involved with. It's all, at that time, people were still collaborating. They weren't fighting about credit. Alan Turing had been in Princeton for 2 years, and as soon as von Neumann heard about this, he sent Bigelow to Manchester, and they brought all the information back. So they already had a 2 kilobit memory, but it wasn't random access. It was running like a delay line. You had to run through, like a television, you had to run through all, if you wanted this bit, you had to go back through all 2,000 of them and say, I want number 1,812, and then you got that bit. So it wasn't very fast. But the Princeton people, who being these very clever war surplus sort of engineers, they figured out how to do this, the timing circuits, to make it random access. So that's Jim Pomeroy, who also just died about 5 years ago. And so they're using, these are just standard war surplus 5-inch oscilloscope tubes. In fact, but they needed them without any flaws. So they made a deal with the Dumont company who was building them. They sent all the tubes they produced went to Princeton, and then they picked the best ones and sent the others back. So which didn't matter for an oscilloscope. It didn't, for an analog oscilloscope, a little tiny speck never made any difference. But to the digital, it did. And so what they did was put a 30,000 gain amplifier at the face of the tube. They put a wire screen out there, and then by going back to a single spot, it will induce a very slight current that's detectable by that amplifier, but just barely detectable. It's unbelievable you could get this to work in New Jersey, where the climate was so bad and everything was damp and thunderstorms. So this is the difference between a 0 and a 1. It's this very fuzzy distinction that you have 0.7 millionths of a second to decide. They had a thing called the discriminator, which when it wasn't working, I think they called it the non-discriminator. Or actually it was called the digit resolver, and they called it the digit dissolver. So that's the architecture of the machine is built like a real engine, a V40 diesel engine with overhead valves. These are the memory registers. So it's really Leibniz's shift register adding machine hooked up to a 5 kilobyte memory. This machine is in the basement of the Smithsonian, not on display. It's Julian Bigelow with the striped tie, and Robert Oppenheimer, Herman Goldstein, and Jerry Estrin, who died 3 weeks ago. Again, one of the last, who then went to Israel and built the first computer at the Weizmann Institute. Some more of the engineers, the whole gang. That's by now they've been pushed off into their own building.
Is that all the Manhattan Project then?
No, this was in Princeton. There were people from the Manhattan Project, but it was after the Manhattan Project. But it had that same. To understand why they did so much so quickly, you have to understand that's where they came from. Everyone had come through World War II when things had to be done fast. And, those codes in England, if you didn't decode it in 24 hours, why do it? It had to be done quickly. The sobering thing is that this entire project was done from start to finish in less time than it took me to write about it. And that's the engineers with their soldering guns who were so unwelcome. And that's the ancestor of your hard disk. That's a wire, magnetic recording wire, input-output drive, 2 bicycle wheels. So it's quite clever. It's on a differential drive, so the wire is going back and forth between the 2 wheels, and that's a 40-bit word with index bits at front and back, and that shows you sort of how you're trying to do useful computation with everything sort of looking fuzzy like that.
Can you explain how the bicycle wheels work for this?
And they were able to get 90,000 bits per second input-output on this. So you have magnetic. At that time, we didn't have tape. Magnetic wire was the recording medium. They only wanted to use commercial, but they wanted it going very fast. So there's wire on both bicycle wheels, and then it's going back and forth between them. One is winding up and one is unwinding. And so it's effectively you have a loop of wire that's like 600 feet long, but instead of having it between 2 pulleys that are 600 feet apart, you have it between 2 pulleys that are next to each other. Is essentially what it's like. It's like having a very long clothesline.
So those spokes are very quickly being charged and uncharged.
No, it's just there's nothing to do with the spokes. It's just this bicycle wheels is what they had. Yeah, the wire is wrapped.
The wire's on the rim.
Yeah, the wire is wrapped on the rim.
And where's the reader part of it?
And then there's a reading head up top, which kept they kept burning up and stuff. So they were really pushing the limits of what you could do with available technology. And then we got tape really soon. Minutes. Okay, we got to rush. Monte Carlo was one of the most successful codes invented partly by Stan Ulam there, who's winning at poker. and it's an example. He was told to he had viral encephalitis to stop thinking, so in the hospital he started playing solitaire and then realized that playing these games of solitaire was equivalent to following the neutron diffusion problems. That's Stan with his wife Françoise, Clary, Johnny's second wife, who he taught to program, and the high point of my whole years of research was finding a filing cabinet. It's always next to the water heater that had all the correspondence between Clary and Johnny von Neumann from 1937 to 1956. So it was all there, and he taught her to do the coding. So all the dawn of coding is all in these letters. His LaSalle, not a Cadillac. Nick Metropolis playing chess against the Los Alamos computer for the first time. Johnny at the Grand Canyon, if you notice, and Clary, and his mule is facing backwards. With Werner von Braun. They worked on weather prediction. They worked on the sort of that's the first day they got a 24-hour weather prediction in less than 24 hours. and then it went very quickly, and then von Neumann was interested in biology, so did these numerical evolution experiments with Niels Baricelli. So there's evolving these artificial universes within the computer. So you look at what they worked on, these 5 problems: explosions, shock waves, meteorology, evolution, stellar. This is a scale of seconds in time. So it's 26 orders of magnitude in time, but very similar mathematical problems. And then if you put sort of things we can comprehend from the blink of an eye to an entire human lifetime, the exact middle is 1 working day, 8-hour day. Which is, I don't understand why that is. Why are we right in the middle of the observable universe? Julian Bigelow, who would be 100 next year. They finally, when von Neumann died, they turned the machine off. So 12 o'clock midnight, off. That's the last entry in the logbook. And then when I discovered Baricelli's papers, there was a full box of all the code for one of these universes with a note that said, there must be something about this code that you haven't explained yet. And that I knew that would be the last sentence in the book. And that really goes back to what Turing was trying to do with the Entscheidungs problem, that you really cannot explain what a code will do. And Turing, we think of him as being the father of deterministic machines. We think of the Turing machine as completely deterministic, but actually he was much more interested in non-deterministic computation, that machines would only become interesting when they would be allowed to make errors and mistakes. And so we remember his 1936 paper, but in 1938 he was already working on non-deterministic computation. And in this paper he developed something called an oracle machine, which is a deterministic machine that occasionally consults somewhere else and does an oracle and does non-deterministic things. And he was interested in the question between ingenuity and intuition, and could you sort of produce intuitive processes using ingenuity, and in a very abstract way, with this, what if it was available in unlimited supply? And now it is. I mean, ingenuity is basically computing cycles, and it is now essential. So all the stuff that Turing dreamed of is now being done. The question of can machines think, which he answered the critics, that if we produce such thinking machines, we're not creating souls any more than we are when we're creating children. We are creating mansions for the souls that only he can create. And when I had that quote in my mind when I went to visit Google in 2005, and that's when I realized, oh, this isn't Turing's mansion, this is Turing's cathedral that we're living in. And then that was the world that Leibniz envisioned in 1697, this world of digital code, and that's the world that you're all working in now. Thanks to all the people who let me dig out these things and save this story while it still existed. Thank you.
Thank you.